Welcome to Senior Living Visionaries, a podcast for senior living leaders who are looking to stay ahead of the curve in the industry. On this show, we feature leaders and innovators in senior living who are pushing the boundaries and creating new, effective services and solutions. And now, let's settle in as host Jennifer Drago connects us with today's guests.
Hi, and welcome to Senior Living Visionaries, where we showcase the leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of senior living. We also occasionally go on solo episodes and share important topics to the senior living industry. I'm your host, Jennifer Drago, strategy consultant and CEO of Peak to Profit. One of the areas that I love to work on in senior living is governance. Usually, in most nonprofit organizations, we have a lot of opportunity to actually improve the way that we do things from a governance perspective. Today, we're going to talk about one of the ones that I see most often across the board. And this has to do with CEO succession planning. And we're also going to talk about a part of that succession planning, which is emergency transition planning. So what happens right when the CEO leaves? What percentage of nonprofit organizations actually have a CEO succession plan? The number will probably surprise you. This is according to a 2021 Leading with Intent board survey. It's a survey of CEOs and board chairs, about 1,000 of them, that took place in 2021, and it's done by the organization BoardSource. They found that only 28.9%, so about 29% of organizations had a written CEO succession plan. And only 27% had an emergency plan, so when there's an abrupt departure of the CEO. So this is important to consider, and as you can see, an area of improvement, of potential improvement for most organizations. So let's talk about first the emergency leadership transition plan. This is, again, an unexpected departure of the CEO. I know an organization in my area where the CEO unfortunately had a stroke and left this board, this organization, in turmoil. It was already financially challenged, to be fair, and the board had to kind of step in and run the organization while also managing the financial affairs and trying to right the ship while waiting to see if the CEO was going to recover and be able to come back to that position. Ultimately, he did not, and he had to be replaced. Unfortunately, his health challenges were too severe. But that was a very significant event for everyone that was on that board because, again, they had to kind of step in and really help run the organization. There wasn't an immediate successor available or ready to step in and to assist. Of course, many of the executives that were there did try to assist, but it was a bit of a challenge. So the first thing that you want to be thinking of as a board is if we did have an abrupt departure of a CEO, it may not be a health challenge. It could actually even be a CEO that you currently have or an executive director in the position who gives notice. And maybe they're going to a competitor organization or an organization that you don't feel comfortable with them remaining in their current position to move on to that new position. So you might need to sever that relationship immediately. Sometimes people, unfortunately, don't give a lot of notice. So lots of ways that an emergency transition might be necessary. So one of the first things that I want you to think about, there's actually 4 areas that you should think about: communications, financial oversight, interim management, and executive search. If your organization had an abrupt departure of the CEO, who in the organization is best suited to step into that interim CEO role? Might be one of the current executives, might actually have to be someone outside the organization. So you might need to seek an interim executive director or CEO while you're actually working on the search process. In some small organizations, I've actually seen the board chair step in as the chief executive. Not always ideal, and it really depends on the organization, but what an important conversation for your board to have about how this could happen and how this should happen. So who is going to step in? Who is the next likely candidate to help continue the operations of the organization? Along with that, a key responsibility of the CEO and of the board is financial oversight. And so you'll need to think about who's going to take responsibility for working with the financial advisors, making sure that the payroll is done, making sure that any other critical information, including 990s, are filed. All of those things that are important from a financial perspective continue to be important. There might be a key lead accountant or chief financial officer in place, so that might be less of a worry for some organizations, but for other organizations, it's going to be really important that you're able to maintain that financial viability and that oversight during that period. You also, of course, want to make sure that the CEO's credit cards, that passwords, access to key financial accounts is removed. That's another important part of this. Next, we'll talk about the communication plan. So you'll want to have both an internal and an external communication plan. So-and-so has left. Here's the person who's going to be stepping in the interim. We're going to have an executive search, what that's going to look like, maybe even an anticipated timeline for this. You can be thinking a lot about the communication, including the board communication around this time. So there's some resources available through BoardSource and other organizations about how to do this executive emergency leadership transition plan, and then also some things to consider. And then finally, executive search. You'll likely want to have a search firm that's helping you select your next executive. This is also a perfect time for an organization to consider, do we need to restructure anything? Is there a partnership opportunity or a merger, an acquisition opportunity that we should be considering? But specifically as it relates to maintaining that chief executive role, if you decide to, great time to be reviewing the job description and making sure that the incoming person matches the characteristics that are best suited for the organization at that time in its life cycle. So executive search is the fourth area. So having that executive leadership transition plan, hopefully you'll never need to use it, but that is number one step, in my opinion, in the CEO succession planning. The second thing that you would want to do as you're talking about your CEO succession plan is first, make sure that the board completely understands the job of the nonprofit executive. And that starts with having a good and up-to-date job description. Here's another statistic from the BoardSource Leading with Intent survey. Only 87% of our chief executive roles actually have a written job description in the nonprofits that were surveyed as part of that survey. So this is an opportunity, and when it's, do you have a job description, but is it up to date? So it's always a great practice each year when you're doing that performance eval to make sure that that job description matches the duties of that chief executive. Another key part, you're going to say, this doesn't sound like succession planning, but it is. It's actually doing that evaluation process. And again, I think it's only 59% of nonprofits actually have an annual performance review of their chief executive. This is something that as an industry, we absolutely have to get better at. But as a board, when we're doing that annual evaluation process of our chief executive, we're looking at their job description. We're looking at how we monitor and measure their performance and that feedback loop to them. We're looking at their salary and benefits, their compensation on a regular basis, which helps us in the event that we need to replace that person because we are up to date on all of those things. So that's another key thing that we do in the succession plan. And then we really need to consider within the organization, are there folks that we're growing that could step into a CEO role at some point in the future? How far out are those folks from being able to take that position? Or in some smaller organizations, really there's not the depth in the org chart to allow for that. So we would have to consider an external search. In an organization that I'm familiar with, that I work with or have worked with as a client, the CEO, it's an organization that offers social work services. The CEO is the founder right now and is a clinical social worker. And so she runs all of the clinical programs. They have a COO who has come in and done the financials, the payroll, runs the HR, provides all the structure, the business structure of the organization, which is fantastic. And right now they operate as a team. What I have that board thinking about is if the CEO, who's also the founder, decides to retire or has an untoward event, could that COO step in without that clinical background to run those programs? Is that person the most viable candidate for that position, or do we need to consider something different? So lots of different things can come into play when you're talking about replacing your chief executive. But these are all discussions that are a lot easier to manage when you're having them ahead of time. And then, goodness, heaven forbid that happens, you're well prepared because you've already answered some of those questions and you have some wheels in motion within your organization. So some of the other elements of an up-to-date succession plan, again, this is from a BoardSource resource. I highly recommend them for succession planning and other governance documents. We said an up-to-date job description, a clear annual performance evaluation, which lists expectations and ways that the chief executive is measured, measurable indicators for the entire performance of the organization, because again, that will tell you, do we have the right person or are we looking for the right person if we know what our KPIs are, what our key performance indicators are for the organization, the process for hiring the new chief executive officer, who's responsible, who's going to be on that committee, who's involved in the interviewing process, will we have an executive search firm, options for managing the executive transition period, whether that's an emergency or kind of a planned methodical exit. That process should have a timeline and key responsibilities so everybody knows who's doing what. You, of course, want to have that emergency transition plan for the unexpected absence of a chief executive. And then just ongoing conversation with a board committee that focuses on this. Now, you may say, what committee could do this? Well, it could be the governance committee, could be the board as a whole. That's a little bit cumbersome. My best recommendation for this, especially if you're doing this for the first time, is to create a succession planning committee. It can be an ad hoc committee of the board that comes together, creates these documents, creates these processes, and then has a periodic process. Perhaps the board reviews all of the documentation on a regular basis just to make sure that nothing has changed. If something has changed, you could, of course, call a new ad hoc succession planning committee and take a look and start that process over. So I hope that you will absolutely consider a succession plan for your CEO, including an emergency leadership transition plan. As I've mentioned, most organizations do not have these documents and these processes thought out. They're not having active conversations about that. Almost 3/4 of organizations are not doing this. So set yourself apart and be prepared for the unexpected. I'm Jennifer Drago. You've been listening to the Senior Living Visionaries podcast, where we explore cutting-edge ideas and breakthroughs that are shaping the future of the senior living industry, and also a few concepts that will help to strengthen the senior living industry. Please subscribe to be notified each time a new episode drops at seniorlivingvisionaries.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Senior Living Visionaries podcast and radio show, where we showcase the leaders and innovators in the industry who are pushing the boundaries and setting the stage for the future in senior living and services. Join us next time as we share the bold ideas and breakthroughs of the industry's most forward-thinking leaders here on Senior Living Visionaries.